So thank you very much again, Barbara, for having accepted the invitation and the time and effort generously for this talk. Yeah, so if you don't mind, I have some very brief introductory note about you and your research, and then we will start with some questions. So, Professor Barbara Rosenwein is an American historian and professor of history at Loyola University, Chicago. She specializes in medieval history and the history of emotions. Among her books are A Short History of the Middle Ages, Generations of Feeling, A History of Emotions, What is a History of Emotions, Love, A History in Five Fantasies, and finally, for our discussion today, Anger, the Conflicted History of Emotions. I'm very pleased to talk to you. I have this brilliant book and enjoyed it. So I will start with the first question, Barbara. Well, I mean, why write about anger, about a negative emotion like anger? People read and write many books, many more books about happiness and self-help than anger.
Yes, it's a really good question. But part of the problem is to define the notion of negative. I suppose that what you mean is that when people feel angry, it's an unpleasant feeling, it's a painful feeling. But as my book shows, this isn't always the case. And some people actually find it quite pleasurable to get angry. It is a way to express power and prestige, and it can also even be seen as virtuous. So it isn't always negative. One of the reasons I chose the topic of anger was because the movements, the radical right movements in the United States were united in expressing anger and doing so without shame or guilt. And we saw that come to a head under Donald Trump, who really reveled in his anger and in his ability to bring out anger in his audience. But I don't choose my topics because everybody wants to read about them, but rather because I'm interested in them. And obviously the situation in the United States was such that I thought this needs looking at, and not just looking at from a contemporary point of view, not even from just the point of view of the start of, let's say, the First World War, modern history, but let's look at la longue durée of the history of anger to see if we can understand something of how we can be where we are today, and to see whether we can understand something about our own anger today, and perhaps, because we are rational creatures sometimes, reassess what anger means to us. So I really wrote the book because I wanted to explore this topic for myself. And I think that history is a really good way to understand all sorts of topics that many people think have only, pardon my saying so, philosophical origins or very contemporary origins. So I really enjoy this long vision of a history over a long period of time. That's also what my new book on love does. It starts, well, basically with Homer, that Western focus is it's my weakness. It has to do with my language knowledge. I just don't read. I mean, I read French and German and Latin, and I can make it through some Greek, but I can't read other languages, and I don't feel right to work on the history of other places. I did that with Buddhism in the anger book, and I felt a little bit worried about that because I can't read Sanskrit. Not,
Right.
I just couldn't read the original languages.
Right. Brilliant. So, I mean, as you mentioned in the book, the book has three actually has been like divided in three different parts, and as you just like can consistently elaborate history of anger from Buddhism to Stoicism to New Stoicism, and like amongst them also Aristotle. I mean, prior to them, there is, as you mentioned, I mean, anger has been treated differently, from being expelled to being repressed to being transcended. So it seems that anger has been regarded very differently, not only by different religions, but also by various schools of thought. And could you please elaborate these three divisions that you make in the book?
Yes, well, the three divisions are anger rejected almost absolutely, because even in the tradition of Buddhism, where anger is quite clearly, utterly rejected, people find a way to justify certain kinds of anger in order to protect the larger good. Then the second section is anger as a vice, but also sometimes as a virtue. And that is a very complicated chapter that really, or part that really discusses the importance of the idea of God's anger. Because previous to this notion of virtue vice in the Christian religion, you have notions of virtue and vice, but they're largely human-centered. Aristotle will say anger is virtuous when it is felt for the right reasons at the right times, against the right people, by the right people. That's a virtue in certain instances. But when you introduce the idea of God's anger, and God is a wrathful God in both the Jewish and Hebrew and Christian traditions, then anger cannot always be a vice. Sometimes it must be a virtue, not depending on human beings, but depending on God.
Right.
And that really changes the possibilities involved in attitudes towards anger. And then finally, the last part is about anger as natural. Natural because it's a product of evolution, natural because it's something that is built into the biological structure. It must, there are laws for it. Psychologists will give, for example, the stages of anger. They will name the stages of anger. First stage is there's a impulse. Second, there's a cause, then an impulse, then a assessment, then a reaction. Well, these are laws. These are scientific laws, as it were. That makes natural anger something that you can't get rid of. You just have to recognize that it's part of human nature. So those are the three divisions, but you could also say, in a way, that the book is divided into two parts. First part is basically anger is not a good thing. And the second part is basically anger is good. And then you have to understand, how could that be? How could you have people with such different attitudes? But actually, people have different attitudes towards everything. There's a really interesting book by Esther Cohen on pain. Pain in the Middle Ages was considered good. It was a good thing. I'm talking about the Latin Middle Ages. Because, first of all, it imitated the pains of Christ. Second of all, it was a kind of penance for sins. And so people understood pain differently than today. Today we're asked, how bad is the pain on a scale from 1 to 10? And then we say it's at 10. And then the doctors say, okay, here's a painkiller, and here, or we say, it's at 1 and we can tolerate it. Okay. But there isn't this notion that somehow I'm virtuous because I'm feeling pain. But in the past, there was that notion. And perhaps today, there are groups that still have that attitude, groups that are not by any means majoritarian, but that exist within small communities where this attitude persists. I can think, for example, of marital couples that are very unhappy but feel that the only virtuous thing is to stay together even though they are in pain.
Right.
And that does still exist, that persists even in America today.
Right.
However high the divorce rate is in America today, there are certain groups, often connected with fundamentalist, either Christian or Jewish, or I don't know about Islam, groups, where just persisting in pain is the virtuous thing to do.
Interesting. I'm also curious about this book you mentioned, On Pain, from Stuart.
Oh yes, this is about pain. The title is The Modified Scream by Esther Cohen, Cohen.
All right. Okay. So, Barbara, it's very interesting what you just raised. They think, interpreted as vice or as virtue, it seems that you appreciate consciousness, being conscious or being cautious about anger. It is something that you, I don't say even tacitly, explicitly in the book appreciate. I mean, being conscious of your anger. It seems like the more we learn about the diversity of words, narratives, scripts, moral judgments, body enactments, medical practices, and religious beliefs about anger, I'm quoting you, the better we will be able to navigate our own lives. End of quote. Why is anger such an important affect, and its consciousness is even yet more important?
Well, why it is so important, an affect, I think has to do with its many uses. It is not just a personal feeling. Sorrow is a little bit, it has certain uses that are external to the individual. Expressions of grief at a funeral, for example. But anger has the particular social use of readjusting relationships. For example, if I get angry at my dear husband because he doesn't do the dishes and he promised he would, I might express my anger and then consider this. He says, what do you expect of me? I don't have to do the dishes. And then I get angrier and angrier and angry. And the two of us build up to a real fight. Or my anger will cause him to rethink and say, oh, you're right. I did promise to do that. I'll do it right now. And then we have readjusted our relationship. And that possibility of readjustment is really useful, because how do we tell each other that things aren't quite right? You know, I love you, but things aren't quite right. Well, we could say it like that, but anger adds a little bit of passion to it and makes it a little bit more of an emergency, so that people are alerted. Oh, okay, that's really important to her or to him. I think then that anger is a really useful affect, but it can become deleterious socially when people get locked in, and that is a problem. People get locked into their anger, feeling my anger is the virtuous, my point of view is the only possible point of view. You are wrong not to see things my way. Well, then there's no working things out, and then you get polarization. And if that becomes a social polarization, then the whole body politic becomes pulled apart. And that's not good. That's chaotic. But you're right. I am an intellectual. I do believe that we should be aware. And the more we are aware, well, the better we can navigate our lives, not just with anger, with all our feelings.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right.
Actually, right now, I'm starting a new book on the feelings of old age.
Oh.
Why?
Wow.
My white hair should tell you a little bit about that, but also because we need to, especially, I don't know, Western society, certainly in the United States, old people are almost not noticed, as if they don't exist. And what struck me when I was younger about my mother, when she was older and she was actually becoming quite confused. She was suffering from dementia, but the one thing that she still had were emotions. She still felt deeply all kinds of things. Some of them were fantasies, but emotional fantasies, and that fascinated me. So I'm starting to look at, through time, what have been the experiences and feelings of old people and of people toward elderly.
Fascinating project. I'm really looking forward to reading that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to getting it written.
Yeah, I'm also having some white hair, as you see. Yeah.
You have a little ways.
So, Barbara, there's a part that is that caught my attention immediately in the book. That was interesting, which was the relation between actually, as one of the main motives of the book, the relation between anger and violence, especially in the first chapter of the book. I'm quoting you: in the modern Western mind, anger, violence, and aggression are persistently associated, almost a knee-jerk reaction, end of quote. And you add that, I'm quoting you again, peace is not the opposite of anger, and violence is not necessarily anger's outcome, end of quote. Yeah. Would you please elaborate this constellation of anger, peace, violence, and so on?
Yes. Actually, I think that modern warfare, to some extent, has brought this to our attention very graphically. Uh, the person behind the computer screen who's uh, guiding the drone to drop a bomb isn't angry, but the act is very violent.
Right,
So
right.
that's very easy to see. Uh, on the other hand, concepts of peace. What is peace? Well, peace, for example, in various Christian notions of heaven, heaven is peaceful, but Saint Peter can get quite angry.
Mm,
Uh,
mm,
and
mm,
because he's angry at sin, right?
mm,
So, I mean, in visions of heaven,
mm.
there are notions of anger still, um, and uh, and then uh, my example of the social benefits of anger should alert us to the fact that one of the ways in which we keep the peace within our intimate relations, our families, with our friends, is to express anger and then to readjust our relationships.
Right.
And that keeps the
Mm,
peace. We couldn't really keep, because people don't interact without conflict because we're individuals with different needs and different desires and different feelings. And how can we actually interact? Well, we have to be able to say when things are not quite right so that we can keep the peace. So in some instances, anger is necessary to keep the peace.
mm.
So that's basically what I meant.
Brilliant. I mean, to me, it means that there is a false, let's say, association or correlation that people think of, like between anger and violence. I mean, not every form of anger means violence, and not every form of peace or lack of anger means non-violence.
Yes, and not every form of violence implies anger. Mhm.
Right, 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 definitely. Um, I go further. I mean, you make a huge difference between rage and anger in the book. And if I'm allowed to say huge, on the one hand, many philosophers have made a difference between anger and ressentiment. For example, Aristotle's definition of anger is, I'm quoting, a desire accompanied by pain for conspicuous revenge for some conspicuous belittlement of oneself or one's friends or family. While anger has plain and honest outburst, as we discussed now, sometimes it is constructive even.
Mhm.
Ressentiment, on the other hand, the word that comes from French, at least for the likes of Nietzsche and Max Schiller in philosophy, is surely an emotion of weakness that typically expresses itself in a hidden way, gradually, obliquely, and deviously. Usually, it doesn't vent itself expressly and at once. Do you think that this difference is significant from the point of view of your project and your research?
Absolutely. In fact, it isn't so much that I make a huge fuss about the difference between rage and anger, is that a subtle message of my book is let's enhance our vocabulary. There isn't one
Right,
anger. There
right,
are many kinds of things that the English word and the the psychologists, mostly Anglophone psychologists, have collapsed into this one capacious word. And here's anger, and it has these rules, and it has such and such facial expression. I really object to that. There are many, many forms of anger, ressentiment and rage and resentment and outrage. And I mean, and the vocabulary has shrunk, and we have lost a lot of subtlety because we have lost the ability to speak of different forms of anger because we don't have the words for them anymore.
I have a question which is perhaps sometimes I just, perhaps it was like my personal engagement with this question without justifying anger. I'm wondering, I mean, don't you think that the ability to control anger, or as you say, to be aware of anger, is partly a privilege that has a lot to do with reflection and education that not everybody on our planet is able to have? I mean, in plenty of cases, those who are angry or enraged are the ones deprived of normal and even basic rights to be able to reflect on their anger.
Well, I think you're bringing up two different issues. When people are deprived of their rights and people are oppressed, if they're feeling anger, there is a certain justification because we live in a world that at least professes belief in equality. If you asked Aristotle, doesn't a slave who has no control over his life and who can be killed at will by his master have the right to be angry? Aristotle would say, what are you talking about? He doesn't have the status of someone who can be angry. No, he can't be angry. There is no way. Okay. But we live in a different kind of society today. And I think that when people know about everybody through social media, through the regular media, through websites such as yours, know that there are differences in the way people live today, then the sense of pain that Aristotle talked about, that sense of pain, of being belittled, is very strong. And it makes perfect sense in that context. But the other point that I think your question embeds is if people don't have much schooling, if people don't read a lot of books, if people don't think a lot about these kinds of questions, doesn't anger become a privilege, or at least useful anger become a privilege of the intellectual elite? And I would say that that point that I just made about the impoverishment of vocabulary does speak to that. If you don't go to school, if you don't learn more than the word anger, if you've never heard of outrage or anything else, any shade, you may in fact have fewer tools with which to work with your own feelings. But I do think that we should give credit to people who don't go to school. The problem for a historian is that few of them write, but many of them can talk. And Ari Hochschild wrote a very interesting book called Strangers in Their Own Land about the far right in the United States. And she did interviews. And she came up with some very interesting insights to the emotional lives and to the anger of people who were not particularly well schooled.
Mm. Um, very much. I just quote you, and I would ask you please to elaborate this sentence. I quote you, the problem is the very idea of righteous anger. Our voices would be far less discordant if we did not believe that our anger is just and virtuous, while theirs is not. If we admitted that we might possibly be wrong. What do you exactly mean by that?
Yes, I probably should have added a word, namely the very idea of righteous anger mirroring the anger of God. Because when we feel angry, we always feel righteous about it. I'm right. The other persons are wrong. But the idea, not only that I am right, but that my anger mirrors the anger of God. It isn't just virtuous on a human scale, but is actually virtuous on an eternal scale. It's the judgment of God.
Mm.
Then there is no way to back down.
Mm.
There is no way to readjust because God is never wrong. So how can you readjust? I mean, if your anger mirrors godly anger, then it isn't wrong. And that's really what I meant. I think I didn't put in that word, although I think in the context that word was implied. But we're really talking about righteous anger from God.
From the theological point of view, from the religious point of view, definitely, right? Yeah. I mean, back to the point that you already talked about it. Interestingly, impoverishment of vocabulary you just talked about. Is it the case that pluralism, in many cases, has been applied to the world of ideas and not emotions? When we are talking about anger, for example, in other words, people seem to believe easier that there are a variety of different ideas about a fact, an object, or an incident than believing in plurality of various feelings, for example, anger or different forms of anger.
Yes, that's right. And that's why I elaborated the notion of emotional communities. We tend to live and have tended in the past to live in groups which share the values of certain emotions, the devaluation of certain emotions, the ways certain emotions should be expressed. We are surprised when other groups, and we are surprised and dismayed when other groups seem to value different emotions or to express them differently. We often pride ourselves on the way in which we express our feelings, whether through multiple gestures, loud voices, or keeping the gestures very minimal, speaking very softly. These are things that people value because emotions are always part of our value system, because otherwise we wouldn't feel anything. We wouldn't feel anything if we didn't value or devalue it. So, I mean, think about love, disgust, fear. All these things are an evaluation, and really a moral evaluation of what we're experiencing. So that's my contribution, if you will, to the notion of pluralism of ideas. We all know that Socrates and Plato had one set of ideas and Aristotle challenged them. We all accept that. Do we accept the notion, though, that Plato valued certain emotions and Aristotle valued others, or that they thought about them in different ways? In other words, this is simplifying a little bit. Do we have two emotional communities in addition to philosophical communities? We're talking about Plato and Aristotle.
Right.
And I think it's a bit easier to see when you don't have such well worked out philosophical systems, but simply when you're looking at people in the world. Like, for example, let's say Cicero, his attitude about what kinds of emotions are good, what kinds of emotions are bad, how to express his emotions, and then compare that, although it's a little bit unfair, with Seneca, about a century later, who really disagrees. So we have letters from both of these people, so we can actually look at, well, what emotions does he express and how, and what emotions does the other guy express? We don't have to look at their philosophical systems. We can just look at things that they probably thought would be read by a public, but were less systematic and coherent than philosophical writings, which are extremely abstract.
Right. In some parts of the book, you mainly focus on the relation between, like the relation between anger and God anger, like this theological understanding of anger. I mean, I'm personally curious to know more about Islam also personally. I mean, it's probably
Yeah.
this is understudied and underexploited, but I'm interested. I mean, like the God in Islam, the difference between anger of God in Islam and anger of God in Judeo-Christian tradition is also interesting for me. But aside from that, there is a part in the book that you focus on the Protestant notion of anger, the role of Protestantism in reducing emotional intensity. Has it, or did it result in your idea, did it result in reducing anger or in transforming anger to some other feelings?
It's very hard for me to say. That's a very good question. I worry about making a judgment that they're really feeling angry, but that anger is coming out in a different way. But what we do see in Protestantism is an attempt to tamp down the emotional life of the believer, but at the same time, really accelerate and expand the emotional life of the believer in relation to God and God's relation to the believer, so that there still is emphasis on something like anger, but the individual feels feels God is angry with me because of my sinfulness. And there is a tremendous emphasis on the sinfulness of the believer until the believer gets a kind of assurance, personal assurance of being saved. But the emotions in Protestantism has only recently been even recognized. It, until about the 2000s, historians said early Protestantism today's, and actually I mean, there were ecstatic Protestantisms even at the beginning, which were very emotional. But for example, Lutheranism, it was thought that Lutheranism really goes along with an absolutistic state, and that the Protestant Lutheran tamps down his or her feelings. But recently, this has been challenged. And so I'm less the expert on Protestantism than a few other people. But I think that it's a topic very much worth exploring.
Thank you. Interesting. Again, an interesting part of the book, in my idea, is where you address violence in the absence of anger. We discuss it briefly, but does it mean that we have at least different forms of violence, one accompanied with anger and others unattended by anger?
I suppose so. I'm always worried about dividing into binaries because I think things are more complicated than that. And of course, we have many forms of anger. And also, I would like to point out that anger is often connected to other emotions like sadness. And so there are forms of violence, I would say, that are connected to forms of anger. And there are forms of violence that are so impersonalized, even though they may be between people, that that anger is not involved. When I say that latter point, I'm thinking of the concentration camp. Primo Levi, on his way to Auschwitz, is beaten by a German soldier, and he says, I never thought that somebody could beat me without being angry at all. He just beat me. You know, the way in which we might hit a fly, are we angry at a fly? I mean, well, it's an annoyance and we hit it. Well, maybe annoyance is a kind of anger, but it's a very different kind of anger than rage.
But I mean, perhaps it's a bit of overgeneralization what I'm telling you now. I mean, but don't you think that, like, by the passage of time, especially embedded in the development of technology, let's say, human being in general has this tendency to be more violent and less angry. I mean, we are able to hide that anger and still be violent. Like, I mean, now the case now between US and Russia, I mean, just now, yeah, it can be very violent, yeah, but
well, just talk about the US and Syria, for example.
Yeah.
Yes, but now people are still feeling a lot of anger, at least in the US. There is a real celebration of anger in all areas. Technology makes the violence more horrible.
Okay, all right. There is a question here about, like, anger and gender. I mean, in some parts of the book, especially the last chapter, as you talk about my anger, our anger, this social, this political side of anger. To what extent do you think anger is gendered?
Well, I don't know about making a universal generalization. What I can say is that historically, anger has been gendered. And when anger is devalued, women can be seen as angry. And when certain kinds of anger can be are devalued, women are said to feel those. Also slaves, also Black people in the United States. It's always been gendered. And today, when there is a women's movement that says women should express their anger the way men do, that is still subtly a gendered notion of anger. So is anger, I mean, the whole notion of this universal emotion that everyone feels at all times, that's scientific, that there is this basic emotion. But I would challenge the basic emotion and really ask, well, how has it been seen? How has anger been seen? And today it is conceived as universal by psychologists, because how else are they going to do their experiments, right? And they have done experiments on gender, but what their subjects come out of a society that has already gendered emotions, not just anger, but all kinds of emotions.
Right.
So psychologists who are working on this try to bring into the laboratory absolute decontextualization, but their subjects are contextual. Their subjects live in the world. So the quick answer to your question is yes, anger is gendered, at least it has always been. Nowadays, in the United States at least, probably in Germany, we're starting to see more than one gender. And it will be really interesting to see whether that matters for our understanding of anger. How does anger function in the trans world? How does it function in the gay world? There's been a little work on that. How does it function in the groups that say I'm bisexual, I'm non-sexual, and then think too of the fact that we live right now in an era that is hypersensitive to notions of sexuality and gender. That hypersensitivity didn't exist in many of the past.
So actually my last question is like, is about writing this book. I mean, was there anything that from starting this research to the end of the research changed in your mind? I mean, like your understanding of anger from the beginning to the end of this research?
Every moment it changed. I cannot tell you how many outlines I had, how many different ways I thought of organizing the book. But that's how I work. I mean, I start out saying, well, I want to look at the anger historically, and I start reading and I start putting together ideas and possible ways of organizing and rework until it kind of clicks into an outline. And I must say that with the Love Book, I first started out thinking I'm going to do it this way. I had all my chapters lined up. Didn't work at all. Yeah, so yes, yes. Books are end products, but they also are works that continue to be in progress. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure talking to you, Barbara. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.